We grow up with the quiet assumption that Earth's orbit is permanent, that the path we trace around the sun is as fixed as gravity itself. A gentle ellipse, repeating endlessly, year after year, spring following winter with machine-like reliability. But this stability is not guaranteed. Earth's orbit is not locked into place by any single force. It is the outcome of a delicate, ongoing negotiation between mass, motion, and gravity, a balance maintained only as long as the wider solar system remains orderly. And while that order has persisted for billions of years, it is not immutable. It is dynamic, contingent, vulnerable. At its most basic level, Earth's orbit is defined by momentum. When our planet formed from the debris disk around the young sun, it inherited a specific velocity, fast enough to keep missing the sun, slow enough to remain bound. That velocity, combined with solar gravity, produced the stable path we now inhabit. But this balance exists only because nothing has meaningfully disrupted it. Yet the solar system is not static. It is a crowded gravitational arena. Massive bodies constantly tug on one another. Jupiter, with more mass than all other planets combined, subtly reshapes the orbits of its neighbors. Asteroids migrate. Comets dive inward from distant reservoirs. Even passing stars, rare but not impossible, can disturb the outer architecture of the system. Over long timescales, these influences accumulate. Orbital change does not require a sudden catastrophe. It can begin as a whisper, a shift of a few thousand kilometers, a slight change in eccentricity, a minuscule alteration in orbital inclination. At first, nothing appears wrong. The sun still rises, seasons still arrive, but beneath that familiarity, Earth's energy balance begins to drift. The amount of solar radiation received over a year changes. The timing of seasons slips. Ice sheets respond. Atmospheres reorganize. Feedback loops awaken. The key danger is not that Earth would immediately fly into the sun or be ejected into space. Those are extreme endpoints. The true apocalyptic risk lies in partial instability, an orbit that remains bound, but no longer benign. A slightly closer orbit means more energy input, amplifying greenhouse effects, evaporating oceans faster than they can regulate heat. A slightly more distant orbit reduces solar flux, triggering runaway glaciation as reflective ice spreads and locks the planet into deep freeze. Increased eccentricity, where Earth swings closer to the sun at one point in its year and farther away at another, would create violent seasonal extremes beyond biological tolerance. And unlike tectonic shifts or volcanic winters, orbital changes operate on a planetary scale. They do not respect borders. They do not spare refuges. There is no higher ground to flee to. What makes this especially unsettling is that orbital stability is not actively maintained. There is no restoring mechanism that guarantees correction if Earth is nudged off course. Gravity does not care about habitability. It obeys equations, not outcomes. In this sense, Earth's orbit is less like a rail track and more like a river current, stable until disrupted, then capable of carrying everything downstream into unfamiliar territory. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of orbital mechanics. Earth survives not because its orbit is sacred, but because it has not yet been seriously challenged. In the next segment, we will examine the first class of forces capable of issuing that challenge: external gravitational intruders, from rogue planets to passing stars, and how even distant encounters could begin unraveling the quiet geometry that keeps our world alive. The solar system feels empty when viewed from Earth. A quiet void punctuated by distant lights, but this sense of isolation is misleading. In reality, we live inside a vast gravitational ecosystem, one that occasionally admits visitors. Some arrive loudly, announced by flaming tails and media headlines. Others pass silently, their influence detectable only through mathematics. And a few never enter at all, yet still manage to reach inside the solar system and rearrange it. These are the intruders, the external gravitational forces capable of disturbing Earth's orbit without ever touching the planet itself. The most unsettling among them are passing stars. Our Sun is not stationary. It orbits the center of the Milky Way, moving through a dense stellar neighborhood on a timescale of hundreds of millions of years. Over Earth's history, other stars have passed within a few light years of the solar system, close enough to tug on its outer regions. Most encounters are distant, producing only subtle effects. But subtle in orbital mechanics does not mean harmless. Far beyond Neptune lies the Oort cloud, a vast halo of icy debris barely bound to the sun. It is a gravitational shoreline, and passing stars disturb it easily. When they do, long-period comets are sent cascading inward, increasing impact risks. But that is only the most obvious consequence. More quietly, these stellar flybys can alter the solar system's overall momentum distribution. Over time, this reshaping can propagate inward, nudging planetary orbits by fractions of a percent. A fraction of a percent is enough. Even closer encounters, still astronomically rare but not impossible over geological time, could directly perturb planetary orbits. A star passing within a few thousand astronomical units would not tear planets free, but it could slightly stretch or compress their paths. Earth would remain bound to the Sun, yet no longer on the same trajectory that once made it habitable. Another class of intruder is even more disturbing, because it may already be present: rogue planets. These are planetary mass objects ejected from their birth systems, wandering the galaxy alone. Estimates suggest they may be as numerous as stars themselves. Invisible unless they pass in front of distant light sources, they drift silently through interstellar space. Most will never come near us, but one does not need to collide with Earth, or even approach the inner solar system, to cause lasting damage. A rogue planet passing through the outer regions could gravitationally disturb the orbits of gas giants. Jupiter or Saturn shifting even slightly would ripple inward like a slow earthquake. The inner planets, locked in a web of resonances, would respond chaotically over time. Earth's orbit might elongate, its tilt could destabilize, seasonal predictability could unravel. This is not cinematic destruction. This is delayed apocalypse. There would be no single moment to point to, no explosion in the sky, no warning sirens. The sky would look the same until it didn't. Winters would begin to linger, or summers would stretch longer than ecosystems can tolerate. Ice ages or heat ages would no longer arrive gradually, but unevenly, erratically. Agricultural calendars would fail first. Ocean currents would follow. Entire climate systems tuned to orbital regularity would drift out of phase with the sun. What makes gravitational intruders especially terrifying is their irreversibility. Once Earth's orbit is altered, there is no natural mechanism to restore it. No damping force pulls the planet back to safety. Gravity preserves change as faithfully as it preserves stability. And unlike impacts or supervolcanoes, orbital disruption does not end quickly. It unfolds over centuries or millennia, long enough for civilizations to recognize the pattern, but too slow to stop. Humanity would not face extinction overnight. It would face something worse, a drawn-out planetary betrayal, where the rules of the sky quietly change and never change back. In the next segment, we will move closer to home, away from cosmic intruders and toward the giants already inside the solar system, exploring how internal gravitational resonances, particularly involving Jupiter and Saturn, could destabilize Earth's orbit from within the clockwork itself. The most dangerous forces acting on Earth's orbit are not the distant ones. They are already here. Jupiter and Saturn are not just planets. They are architects of motion. Their immense masses shape the gravitational structure of the entire solar system, enforcing rhythms that keep smaller worlds, including Earth, on predictable paths. For billions of years, these rhythms have held. The gas giants move in a complex gravitational dance, locked into near-resonant relationships that stabilize the system as a whole. But resonance is not the same as permanence. In orbital mechanics, resonance is a condition where periodic gravitational influences reinforce one another. When stable, it creates harmony. When disturbed, it amplifies chaos. A small shift in Jupiter's orbital period, triggered by an external flyby, a slow migration, or long-term gravitational drift, could push the system across a threshold. Past that point, the same forces that once stabilized Earth would begin to destabilize it. This kind of change would not announce itself with a flash in the sky. It would arrive as misalignment. At first, Earth's year would remain almost the same length. Days would still pass normally, but careful observers would notice anomalies, seasons arriving slightly earlier or later each decade, solstices drifting against ancient calendars, climate models failing to converge. The sky would look familiar, but the math behind it would no longer close cleanly. Living through this phase would feel like inhabiting a planet that has lost its internal clock. Winters would grow harsher in some regions while weakening in others. Monsoons would miss their appointments. Jet streams would stall or meander unpredictably. Farmers would be the first to understand that something fundamental had broken, not politically, not economically, but astronomically. As Jupiter and Saturn slipped deeper out of resonance, Earth's orbit could begin to change shape. Increased eccentricity would stretch the planet's path, pulling it closer to the sun for part of the year and pushing it farther away for the rest. Summers would grow brutally hot. Winters would deepen into prolonged freezes. The concept of a temperate zone would dissolve. Human bodies are adaptable, but agriculture is not. Neither are oceans. Ice sheets would expand and retreat violently, destabilizing sea levels. Coastal cities would endure repeated abandonment as shorelines advance and withdraw. Permafrost would thaw, refreeze, and fracture infrastructure from below. Entire regions would swing between flood and drought within a single lifetime. And above all of this would hang the knowledge that nothing is wrong locally. No fault line has slipped. No volcano has erupted. No war has begun. The sun still shines. The earth still spins. Yet every year, survival requires more energy, more planning, more sacrifice. Civilization would enter a permanent state of adaptation without recovery. As resonance chaos deepens, Earth's axial tilt could also become unstable. Even a few degrees of additional tilt would be catastrophic. Polar regions could receive direct sunlight during parts of the year, while equatorial regions plunge into darkness. Entire hemispheres would experience seasons so extreme they would resemble alien worlds. Living through such changes would fracture cultures and identities. Nations anchored to latitude would lose meaning. Migration would become cyclical rather than directional, with populations chasing survivable conditions as they oscillate across the globe. Borders would blur, not because humanity had united, but because geography itself had stopped cooperating. There would be no villain to blame, no decision to reverse, no technology to deploy at planetary scale. Orbital chaos does not negotiate. The deepest existential dread would not come from suffering alone, but from certainty, the certainty that Earth's relationship with the sun has entered a phase that human time cannot outwait. Children would grow up knowing their planet is becoming less predictable each year, not because of mistakes made on the surface, but because of motions unfolding far beyond their reach. In the next segment, we will explore one of the most terrifying outcomes of orbital destabilization: runaway feedback loops, where climate, ice, oceans, and atmosphere amplify orbital changes into irreversible planetary states, worlds of fire or ice from which Earth cannot return. There is a moment in planetary history when change stops being gradual and becomes permanent. A threshold where feedback loops take over and the future narrows into only a few remaining outcomes. For Earth, orbital instability does not need to be dramatic to cross that line. It only needs to persist long enough for the planet's self-regulating systems to fail. Once Earth's orbit becomes more eccentric, once seasons stretch and compress beyond familiar bounds, the climate no longer responds linearly. Ice, oceans, and atmosphere begin to amplify the changes rather than resist them. What was once a buffer becomes an accelerant. This is how Earth becomes a runaway world. On one possible trajectory, Earth drifts slightly closer to the Sun during part of its orbit. The increase in solar energy is modest at first, barely measurable without instruments, but warmer oceans release more water vapor. And water vapor is a powerful greenhouse gas. More heat creates more vapor. More vapor traps more heat. The feedback loop closes. Living through this phase would feel deceptively survivable at first. Summers become longer. Heat waves become routine. Air conditioning shifts from convenience to necessity. Power grids strain but hold. Governments issue adaptation plans instead of emergency declarations. Then crops begin to fail. Not everywhere at once, but often enough to destabilize global trade. Staple grains suffer heat stress. Pollination windows drift out of sync. Soil moisture collapses. Food becomes expensive, then scarce, then strategic. As oceans warm, they lose their ability to absorb carbon dioxide efficiently. Atmospheric CO2 rises faster, thickening the thermal blanket around the planet. Coral reefs bleach into extinction. Fisheries collapse. Coastal economies hollow out. Psychologically, humanity enters a state of permanent summer anxiety. Sleep becomes difficult. Tempers shorten. Cities feel hostile even at night. Outdoor labor becomes lethal in some regions. The concept of normal weather vanishes, replaced by daily risk calculations. Eventually, parts of Earth cross wet bulb temperature thresholds where the human body can no longer cool itself. Not indefinitely. Not eventually. Immediately. These regions are not destroyed. They are simply abandoned. Migration accelerates, but there is no true refuge. Every degree of latitude gained is temporary. Governments harden borders not out of malice, but desperation. Cooperation fractures under thermal stress. Civilization does not burn. It overheats. On the other trajectory, Earth spends too much time farther from the sun. Summers weaken. Snow lingers. Ice reflects more sunlight, cooling the planet further. Ice spreads, not gradually, but aggressively, marching across continents. The feedback loop closes again. Living through planetary cooling is quieter, but no less devastating. Growing seasons shorten. Crops fail from lack of heat rather than excess. Forests retreat. Grasslands turn brittle. Fuel consumption skyrockets as heating becomes a survival requirement rather than a seasonal expense. Cities designed for temperate climates struggle under relentless cold. Infrastructure cracks. Power generation falters. Transportation slows. Entire nations become energy poor overnight. Psychologically, this world produces compression rather than agitation. People retreat indoors. Social life collapses inward. Cultures become insular. Fear takes the form of hoarding, isolation, and suspicion rather than violence. Silence replaces noise. As ice sheets expand, sea levels drop, exposing new land. But it is sterile, wind-scoured, and useless. Coastal ports fail. Global trade withers. Civilization fragments into regional survival enclaves, clustered around remaining heat sources. The sky grows sharper, brighter, cruel. In both futures, the most devastating loss is not population, it is time. Long-term planning becomes impossible. Education shifts from aspiration to survival literacy. Art becomes nostalgic. Religion either collapses or hardens into fatalism. Children grow up fluent in crisis language but unfamiliar with stability. Governments lose legitimacy not because they are cruel, but because they are irrelevant. No policy can stop orbital mechanics. No election can change the sun's distance. Authority fractures into local control, then into household autonomy. The idea of a shared human future dissolves. And hovering over every conversation is the same unbearable realization. The planet has chosen a direction, and it is no longer listening. In the next segment, we will explore the most haunting possibility of all, not immediate fire or ice, but a slow oscillation between extremes where Earth never settles, trapping civilization in an endless cycle of adaptation, collapse, and partial recovery without end. There are outcomes worse than extinction. One of them is never being allowed to settle. In this scenario, Earth does not commit fully to fire or ice. Its altered orbit, more eccentric, slightly unstable, subtly chaotic, forces the planet into an endless swing between extremes. Each year, Earth passes too close to the sun to remain cool, then retreats too far to remain warm. The climate never equilibrates. Feedback loops activate, collapse, then reactivate in the opposite direction. The planet becomes a pendulum. From space, Earth still looks alive. Blue oceans persist. Clouds still swirl. There is no single catastrophic moment that signals the end. Instead, habitability becomes seasonal, regional, temporary. Survival depends not on where you live, but when. Living on such a world would feel like permanent jet lag at a civilizational scale. Summers become unbearable. Not consistently, just often enough to kill crops and people without warning. Winters do not arrive gently. They crash in early, linger too long, then vanish abruptly. Infrastructure is never designed for the conditions it actually faces. Cities overheat, then freeze, then crack apart under the stress of both. Nothing stays repaired. Psychologically, this is where humanity begins to fracture in ways no disaster has caused before. People can endure hardship when it has a narrative. Recovery, rebuilding, return. Oscillation offers none of that. Every adaptation is temporary. Every solution expires. Every generation is told honestly that the world will not stabilize within their lifetime, or their children's. Fatigue becomes the defining emotion of the species. Governments stop announcing long-term plans. Instead, they issue rolling survival advisories. Education systems abandon future-oriented curricula. Children are taught situational skills: heat response, cold rationing, migration readiness, system repair. History feels irrelevant. The past belonged to a stable planet. Families hesitate to have children, not out of fear of death, but fear of inheritance. What does it mean to bring someone into a world that cannot promise seasons, safety, or continuity? Birth rates fall unevenly. Some cultures lean into fatalism, others into denial. None escape grief. Migration becomes cyclical and exhausting. Populations move north, then south, then inland, then back again. Borders lose meaning, then regain it violently, then dissolve once more. Identity fractures as people stop belonging to places and start belonging to roots. The concept of home erodes. On an oscillating Earth, even hope becomes unstable. Each brief recovery, each tolerable decade, raises expectations that are inevitably crushed by the next swing. Optimism becomes dangerous. Pessimism becomes safer, but corrosive. Mental health collapses quietly, not through panic, but through resignation. People stop asking how bad will it get, and start asking how long until it flips again. Relationships strain under constant uncertainty. Communities thin as individuals conserve energy, not just fuel or food, but emotional capacity. The sky becomes an antagonist. People track the sun obsessively. Its angle, its intensity, its timing. What was once background becomes threat. The calendar loses authority. Astronomical predictions replace civic ones. The future is measured in orbital diagrams, not years. And beneath all of this lies the deepest despair of the oscillating world. There is no mistake to correct. Humanity did not cause this instability. It cannot undo it. There is no villain to overthrow, no emission to reduce, no machine to shut down. The planet is not punishing humanity. It is simply obeying physics in a configuration that no longer favors life. Civilization does not collapse all at once. It thins. It simplifies. It abandons complexity not out of ideology, but exhaustion. Art becomes quieter. Architecture becomes temporary. Culture becomes lightweight, portable, disposable. Generations grow up fluent in loss. Children inherit not stories of progress, but instructions for departure. Elders remember stability like a myth, spoken of carefully, lest it feel cruel. The idea of a permanent future becomes abstract, almost obscene. Earth continues to swing. Humanity continues to endure. In the next segment, we will confront a question this world raises. What happens when a species realizes that survival on its home planet may no longer be the optimal strategy and begins to consider leaving, not as exploration, but as escape? The idea of leaving Earth begins quietly, not as ambition, not as conquest, but as inheritance. At first, it appears in planning documents and contingency models, then in school lessons framed as options. Eventually, it enters family conversations spoken carefully, the way one speaks around grief. Leaving is no longer framed as betrayal of home, but as an act of continuity, a way to carry something human forward when the planet itself can no longer promise stability. For the generation that first considers departure, the decision feels hypothetical. They still remember seasons that held, landscapes that lasted. Their grief is rooted in comparison. They measure loss against memory and feel it sharply. But for their children, Earth is already unstable. And for their children's children, instability is the only Earth they know. This is how psychological inheritance reshapes a species. The youngest generations grow up fluent in orbital language. They learn the sky not as poetry, but as probability. Their sense of time is not tied to calendars or anniversaries, but to windows of survivability. They inherit stories of snow that stayed, summers that rested, oceans that fed reliably. But these stories feel mythic, almost fictional. Earth becomes a former home, even while they still live on it. When off-world habitats are proposed, orbital stations, lunar refuges, subsurface settlements, eventually distant colonies, they are not sold as progress. They are sold as stability, controlled environments, predictable cycles, artificial seasons that do not drift, gravity that can be measured and adjusted, skies that never surprise. To the elders, this feels like surrender. To the young, it feels like mercy. Psychologically, a fracture opens between generations. Those who remember Earth's reliability cling to the idea of return. They speak of waiting out the oscillations, of eventual equilibrium. Their identity is planetary. Leaving feels like erasure. But the young do not frame identity that way. They are portable by necessity. They belong not to land, but to systems. Air recyclers, thermal envelopes, orbital mechanics. These are the environments that raised them. Earth is emotionally powerful, but practically hostile. When departures finally begin, they are not mass evacuations. They are selections. Engineers, biologists, caretakers, children, not chosen for superiority but for continuity. The psychological weight of selection becomes unbearable for those left behind and quietly corrosive for those who leave. Survivors inherit guilt as much as hope. On Earth, communities watch launch lights rise and disappear, knowing they are watching a lineage diverge. For those who leave, the trauma does not end in space. It transforms. They carry Earth inside them, its instability encoded as vigilance. Every environmental fluctuation inside a habitat triggers ancestral fear. A pressure drop feels existential. A power outage feels apocalyptic. The descendants of Earth's oscillation grow up hyper-aware of fragility, even in engineered safety. They do not romanticize planets. They know that homes are temporary. Children born beyond Earth inherit a double absence. They never knew a stable planet, and they never truly lived on the one that birthed them. Their education includes Earth history, not as triumph, but as caution. A case study in how habitability is conditional. They learn that planets can betray without intent, and that survival requires humility rather than dominance. Meanwhile, on Earth, those who remain adapt to a quieter despair. Leaving does not solve the planet's suffering. It reframes it. Earth becomes a place people endure rather than invest in. Long-term restoration efforts fade. Why rebuild what may not last? Why plan for centuries when decades are uncertain? Psychological inheritance completes its turn. Hope detaches from place. The most haunting outcome is not abandonment, but normalization. Children on Earth grow up knowing some people leave and some stay, and that neither choice is wrong. Departure becomes just another rite of passage like migration once was, except this migration leaves the sky entirely. Earth becomes a cradle, not a destination. And across generations, a subtle shift occurs in how humanity defines survival. It is no longer about preserving a planet at all costs. It is about preserving continuity, language, memory, ethics, across environments that cannot be trusted to remain kind. In the next segment, we will explore what it means to be human, once home is no longer a place, but a trajectory, and whether a species shaped by planetary instability can ever stop moving again. At some point, humanity stops thinking of itself as a planetary species. There is no announcement when this happens, no declaration, no philosophical council convenes to rename what humans are. The shift occurs quietly, across generations, as motion replaces settlement and continuity replaces belonging. Humanity becomes kinetic. The first off-world habitats were designed as refugees, places to wait while Earth struggled through instability. But waiting requires the belief that something stable is coming. As decades pass, then lifetimes, that belief erodes. The oscillations continue. The projections stretch outward. Earth does not recover. It simply persists, unevenly, unpredictably. So the habitats begin to move. Orbital stations adjust altitude and inclination to manage radiation and thermal stress. Lunar and asteroid settlements reposition themselves for resource access. Deep space vessels no longer feel temporary. They become generational homes designed to operate indefinitely without anchoring to any world. Children are born in transit. They grow up in environments where arrival is not the goal. Motion is normal. Acceleration schedules replace seasons. Windows show stars sliding past instead of landscapes standing still. Gravity is a variable, not a given. Psychologically, this rewires identity at its foundation. On Earth, identity once emerged from place, valleys, rivers, climates, borders. Even in cities, people belong to neighborhoods shaped by geography. But for a species in motion, place dissolves. Identity becomes procedural. You are who you are because of the systems you maintain, the skills you carry, the route you are on. Belonging shifts from land to infrastructure. People identify with vessels, habitats, fleets. They speak of maintenance histories the way ancestors once spoke of homelands. Family stories are not about where someone came from, but about which system failed, which reroute saved them, which decision kept the air flowing. This produces a strange, emotional flattening. Joy still exists, love persists, but grief changes shape. There is no homeland to mourn losing, only configurations that are no longer viable. When a habitat is decommissioned or a route abandoned, it feels less like exile and more like a protocol update. Loss becomes abstracted, procedural, survivable. But something deeper erodes alongside it: rest. A species without a stable planet never fully relaxes. Even in moments of calm, motion hums beneath consciousness. Systems are always running. Alarms can always sound. Every generation inherits a low-level vigilance that never turns off. This is post-planet psychology. Sleep patterns shift. Dreams feature malfunctions more than memories. Art loses landscapes and gains schematics, star fields, recursive geometry. Spirituality turns inward or outward, toward cosmic insignificance or system reverence, but rarely toward Earth itself. Earth becomes symbolic rather than central. It is taught in schools as origin, not destiny. A formative environment, like an ancestral savanna no one expects to return to. Beautiful, important, finished. For those still living on Earth, this transformation feels like abandonment, even when it is not intended. They watch humanity stretch outward, growing thinner, more distributed, less emotionally tethered to the planet that shaped it. Earth becomes quieter, not because people are gone, but because fewer futures point back to it. Meanwhile, for those born in motion, the idea of settling on a single world feels dangerous, even irresponsible. Why bind yourself to one gravity well when history has shown how fragile that bond can be? Why build permanence on something that cannot promise it? Stability is no longer defined by geography. It is defined by redundancy. This is the paradox of the post-planet species. It survives by letting go of the very concept that once made survival meaningful. Home is no longer somewhere you return to. It is something you carry, replicate, and eventually outgrow. And yet, beneath the efficiency, a quiet question lingers, one no generation can fully silence. If humanity never stops moving, what exactly is it moving toward? When humanity no longer lives on a planet, meaning itself begins to drift. For most of human history, culture was anchored to geography. Myths rose from mountains. Gods lived in skies that stayed put. Calendars followed seasons that returned reliably. Even abstract ideas, nation, tradition, ancestry, were ultimately rooted in land. Meaning had gravity. But once humanity becomes unbound, culture loses its ground reference. At first, this feels liberating. Without borders, culture travels freely. Languages blend faster, traditions remix. Art circulates between habitats at the speed of data. No single place claims authority over what is authentic. Identity becomes customizable, portable, adaptive. Then something subtler happens. Without a stable environment pushing back, culture stops being shaped by necessity and starts being shaped by optimization. Stories are refined to travel well. Rituals are shortened to fit transit schedules. Music adapts to acoustics of sealed spaces. Architecture becomes modular, not just structurally, but symbolically. Nothing grows wild anymore. Children raised without ground do not internalize place-based meaning. They do not feel the emotional weight of soil, weather, or horizon. Their metaphors are technical. Their poetry references pressure, flow, redundancy, signal delay. Beauty is found in balance, efficiency, symmetry. This is not emptiness, but it is different. Over generations, nostalgia becomes an inherited emotion with no direct referent. People mourn Earth without having known it. They grieve forests they never walked in, oceans they never swam in. Earth becomes a shared dream, powerful, emotional, and increasingly abstract. Culture begins to split. Some groups attempt regrounding. They recreate seasons artificially, design habitats with simulated weather, impose cycles of growth and decay. They plant soil not for food, but for meaning. These efforts are sincere, even moving, but they are also controlled. The storms always stop on schedule. The winters never kill. Other groups abandon grounding entirely. They embrace fluid identity, rejecting permanence as a dangerous illusion. Their culture celebrates transition, adaptability, impermanence. Art is ephemeral by design. Memory is archived rather than embodied. Loss is accepted as structural, not tragic. Between these poles, tension grows. Without Earth as a shared reference point, there is no longer a universal human experience. Childhood differs radically between habitats. Values diverge based on environmental control philosophies. Ethics splinter, not violently but irreversibly. The question, what is a good life, no longer has a common answer. Psychologically, this produces a low-level disorientation that never resolves. People feel meaningful, but not rooted. Purpose exists, but feels provisional. Even love changes shape. Partnerships are often framed around system compatibility rather than shared place. The most unsettling shift is this: meaning becomes engineered. Ceremonies are designed intentionally. Moral frameworks are optimized for stability. Cultural symbols are stress-tested for survivability across environments. Nothing is allowed to be too fragile, because fragility reminds people of planets. And yet, something essential is lost in that robustness. On Earth, meaning often emerged unintentionally, from accidents of geography, from disasters survived, from histories no one planned. In space, meaning is curated, safe, resilient, and slightly hollow. People begin to ask a dangerous question. If meaning must be built deliberately to survive, was it ever real to begin with? This question does not lead to despair immediately. Instead, it leads to quiet experimentation. New philosophies arise that treat meaning not as truth, but as process, something enacted continuously rather than discovered. Identity becomes something you do, not something you inherit. Humanity adapts again, but adaptation carries a cost. The farther culture drifts from Earth, the harder it becomes to explain why survival matters beyond continuation itself. Without land, without seasons, without uncontrollable risk, meaning struggles to feel earned. And somewhere, deep in archives and stories and half-forgotten images, Earth persists, not as a destination, but as a reminder of what meaning once felt like when it grew unplanned. In the next segment, we will approach the final reckoning of this journey, whether a species that has survived by constant adaptation can ever choose to stop, and what it would mean to return, not physically, but philosophically, to the idea of belonging again. The question does not arrive suddenly. It emerges slowly, the way gravity does, felt long before it is named. After generations in motion, after culture adapts and meaning reorganizes itself around systems rather than soil, humanity begins to notice something unexpected. Earth is still there. Not healed, not stable, but not gone. From orbit, the planet continues its uneven dance. Fire years followed by cold decades, habitable regions shifting like tides. It remains hostile to permanence, but no longer immediately lethal everywhere. Life persists stubbornly in pockets. Human settlements remain, smaller, quieter, deeply adapted. And so the debate begins, not as policy, but as philosophy. Should humanity return? For those who never left, the question feels insulting. They endured the oscillations. They rebuilt again and again. They accepted Earth not as it was, but as it became. To them, return implies abandonment, that survival elsewhere was chosen over responsibility here. For those born away from Earth, the question feels alien in a different way. Why return to instability when controlled environments offer predictability? Why trade redundancy for gravity wells, climate chaos, and geological risk? The divide is not technological. It is psychological. Earth represents uncontrolled meaning. Returning means accepting seasons that do not obey schedules, weather that cannot be overridden, ecosystems that collapse without warning. It means relinquishing the illusion of total systems mastery that space habitats quietly cultivate. Some see this as humility. Others see it as regression. Early return missions are cautious. Small groups, long-term observers. They do not land to reclaim, but to listen. They rebuild lightly, structures designed to be abandoned, agriculture meant to fail gracefully. They treat Earth not as a home, but as a collaborator with veto power. Living on Earth again is emotionally overwhelming. Gravity feels heavy, not just physically, but psychologically. The sky is too large, the horizon too permanent. There are no walls holding catastrophe back. People sleep differently. Dreams change. The planet intrudes on the subconscious in ways space never did. Children born on Earth after generations away grow up sensing something their parents struggle to name: belonging without control. They experience loss directly, storms, die-offs, failed seasons, but also joy that feels unmanufactured. Nothing is optimized. Everything is contingent. For some, this feels like meaning returning. For others, it feels intolerably unsafe. The choice to return fractures humanity once more, but this time, not along lines of survival, but values. One branch believes meaning requires risk, that culture needs friction with an environment that does not care, that humility, grief, and adaptation are the price of being real. The other branch believes meaning is something humanity carries internally now, that suffering is not a requirement, that survival has already proven its point, and there is no virtue in returning to planetary unpredictability. Neither side is wrong. Neither side can convince the other. Over time, humanity accepts a plural future. Some remain with Earth, committing to a slow, uncertain partnership. They abandon dreams of dominance and instead practice restraint, learning when not to intervene, when to retreat, when to let systems fail and recover on their own. Others remain in motion, refining closed ecosystems, expanding outward, building cultures that value continuity over place. To them, Earth becomes a powerful ancestor, respected, remembered, but not revisited. The tragedy and the quiet beauty is that this may be the first time humanity truly chooses its future, rather than reacting to crisis. Earth no longer commands allegiance. It invites it, and that invitation is not universal. In the final segment, we will step back from the mechanics, the migrations, and the philosophies to confront the ultimate question this journey leaves behind. When a species survives the loss of its home, what does it owe that home, and what does it owe itself? In the end, there is no final disaster, no last sunrise, no moment where the story closes cleanly. Earth continues. Its orbit remains altered, never quite settling, never fully breaking. Seasons still arrive, but unevenly. Life persists in fragments, adapting where it can, retreating where it must. The planet does not forgive, and it does not condemn. It simply moves. And humanity, changed by motion and loss, must decide what legacy means when permanence is no longer possible. For most of human history, legacy was tied to place. Cities, monuments, borders, graves. We marked the land to prove we had been here, and to ensure we would be remembered. But a species shaped by planetary instability cannot rely on land to remember it. Legacy becomes something else. For those who remain on Earth, legacy is restraint. Learning when not to build, when not to extract, when to let ecosystems recover on their own terms. Their inheritance is humility, an understanding that survival does not grant ownership. They leave lighter marks, temporary structures, irreversible decisions. Their children learn not how to conquer the planet, but how to listen to it. For those who left, legacy is continuity. They carry Earth forward not as territory but as memory, ethics, and caution. They teach their children that planets are not guaranteed, that environments are not promises, that stability is something borrowed rather than owned. Earth becomes a lesson encoded into culture. Never confuse survivability with permanence. Across both paths, a quiet reconciliation emerges. Humanity stops asking whether leaving or staying was right. The question dissolves under time. What matters instead is whether humanity learned anything from the loss of certainty, whether adaptation deepened wisdom or merely extended survival. The final reckoning is not technological. It is philosophical. Did humanity become more humble, more patient, more careful with the environments that sustain it? Or did it simply learn how to outrun consequences? In archives, children study Earth's long history, not as a tragedy, but as a turning point. A moment when humanity realized that being native to a planet does not mean being entitled to it, that survival does not imply dominion. That meaning is not guaranteed by endurance alone. The most profound legacy is this shift in posture. Humanity no longer sees itself as the center of a world, but as a participant in systems far larger than itself. Whether on Earth or in motion, it carries a new ethic, to exist without assuming permanence. And perhaps that is enough. Earth does not need humanity to survive. Humanity does not need Earth to continue. But between those two truths lies a fragile, intentional relationship, one chosen rather than inherited. In the final image of this story, there is no triumph and no mourning. Only a planet in motion, and a species that finally understands what motion costs,